All right, arguments for the defendant, and we'll hear first from Ms. Hamburger.
Good afternoon. On April 9th, 2014, Nate Holden inflicted horrific pain on his family, on his children. Pain and trauma that they will live with for the rest of their lives. He put the lives of officers of the law at risk. Officers just doing their job, serving their communities. You have found Nate Holden guilty of first-degree murder. That means that he will spend the rest of his life in prison. He will live in a tiny cell, away from his family and children. He will be told what to do and when to do it for the rest of his life, and he will never be released. You, with your verdict on Monday, you have assured that. We're here right now because the state of North Carolina is arguing to you that life in prison is not enough punishment for Nate Holden. They are asking you to send Nate not just to prison, but to death row, to await his execution, to await death. And you've had a chance to hear the prosecutor's arguments for why you should do this. And I think if you were listening, you heard they made it sound kind of like a formula. Calculate the weight of the bowling balls and calculate the weight of the feathers, arrive at the right answer. This is not a math problem. Yes, the law provides you with a process to guide you in this decision, but make no mistake. The ultimate question before you is the value of this man's life. As you consider the circumstances, as you weigh them, that is the question. And the law never requires a death sentence. It certainly does not require a death sentence in this case. You, the members of the jury, you get to determine whether Nate's life still has value, even despite what he did. We sometimes talk about the death penalty as being reserved for the worst of the worst. The term I think the state used was the egregious case. We talk about it being for the worst offenders, for the most inhuman acts. But what could possibly be more human than the story that has unfolded in this courtroom? In the first phase, we heard about two Nate Holdens. There was the father and husband who wasn't perfect, but he tried his best, loved his family. And then there was the Nate Holden who committed the terrifying acts of April 9th, 2014. And I know you may have been left wondering why. Yes, he was upset about the separation, the child custody situation. Obviously, that was a very important factor. But where did that violence come from? And now, with the evidence we've presented in the sentencing phase, you at least begin to have an answer to that question, starting with the violence in his childhood. So here is Nate's elementary school photo. You saw this. He's what? Little kid here. A really sweet child. That's what one teacher described him as in elementary school in his school records. This is Nate, a child. And what was happening at home when this photo was taken? This little boy, sleeping in his bunk bed, woken up in the middle of the night to another fight. His mother, the little chihuahua, going after his father for being out with other women. His father shouting back about her drinking. The sound of things breaking. The sound of his father's fists. The sound of his mother screaming. And his little sister crying. Crawling into his bed, he tries to comfort her, but he's just a little boy. And then, if it got really bad, you heard what Katina would do. She would slide down between the bed and the wall to protect herself. And little Nate would venture out there into the night. And you heard what Goldie said he would say. He said, "Dad, stop hitting my mama." Maybe they would get to sleep, maybe Dad would leave, maybe things would calm down. Maybe he'd get back to sleep and the next morning, come out, see the house, broken plates, holes in the walls. Maybe Dad's gone, not sure when he's coming back. And what else would he see? His mother's bruises. Bruises like these. Maybe worse. Maybe so bad she had to stay home from work. And then Nate and his little sister, he probably helped her get ready for school, don't you think? Off they go to school. And you could hear in their testimony, the brave testimony of his family, you could hear the responsibility his family put on him in these situations. This little boy tasked with keeping his mother safe. This little boy tasked with controlling his father's temper, with keeping chaos at bay. But he didn't really have that power, did he? Because sometimes Nate couldn't break up the fight. Sometimes he could, and sometimes he couldn't. And of course this trauma impacted him. And don't you think that seeing this on a regular basis might result in distressing and intrusive memories that would be a symptom of PTSD? I don't think the fact that Nate had to self-report that suggests that that's not true. Of course you'd have intrusive memories about witnessing this on a daily basis or a regular basis when you're a child. Regardless of whether there's a PTSD diagnosis or not, of course this impacted him. How could it not? As Nate got older, he began to see that he didn't want to live like this for the rest of his life, to his credit. But what's the solution? He wasn't being modeled appropriate ways of behaving. He came up in his childish mind with his own solution. If I don't like what I'm seeing, I'm going to do the opposite. If I see hitting, I'm not going to hit. I see infidelity, so I'm not going to cheat. I see separation, okay, well then don't leave. Stay in the marriage. I see anger, I'm not going to feel anger. I see an unhappy family, I will make a happy family. And if I do these things, and if I do them just right, everything will be fine and happy. And it's all up to me. It's always all been up to me since I was a little boy trying to keep my dad from killing my mom. It's all up to me to keep my family intact. And given everything, he managed amazingly well. You saw JT testify. What a lovely young man Nate and LaTanya raised. But life doesn't always go according to our plans, right? In fact, does it ever go according to our plans? The question isn't if hard times will come, but when. And when they do, how will we deal with them? And learning how to deal with hard times is a lifelong process, right? But if we're lucky, we got some wisdom along the way, some wisdom from our parents or our grandparents. But the trauma and dysfunction in Nate's family left him with no healthy coping skills. This was the wisdom that his family imparted to him. Both parents had their ways of coping. Dad had his women. Mom had her alcohol and her drugs. And Nate developed his own coping skill. LaTanya. All his hopes and dreams of safety and normality in this one beautiful person. Here's the photo of their wedding day. If you looked at it closely when it came around before, you could see the tears of joy in his eyes, and hers as well. Have you ever seen two young people looking so happy on their wedding day? But marriage is hard work, right? It's not a fairy tale. They had problems, typical problems, the kinds of problems lots of couples are able to work through. But where would Nate have learned how to work through those problems? Not at home, not with the trauma he endured. And then she left. And she didn't just leave, she tried to take the kids. There was the custody battle, the conflicts with Sylvester. This would have been a dark period in anyone's life, but even more to Nate, who'd built his whole identity on being a father and a husband. And even more so because he had no coping strategy to fall back on. He learned in childhood to stuff his feelings, especially anger, because he'd learned that anger meant violence and he didn't want to be violent. So he stuffed it. He stuffed it into that container that Dr. Blackshear talked about. But there was already a lot of stuff in that container. The abuse of his mother, the trauma of seeing her on the streets a crack addict, the baseball bat assault, the home invasion robbery. He couldn't stuff anymore. And he ended up reenacting what had been modeled for him, violence. In his effort to escape the violence of his childhood, he ended up tragically repeating the same pattern. A human story, the story of a family. Not a math problem, maybe something out of literature or psychology, but certainly not a math equation. The value of Nate's life cannot be boiled down to a formula. It is borne out in a whole collection of tiny moments, actions that are impossible to convey in a courtroom. But you've seen glimpses, or at least I hope you have. You've seen that brave testimony of his family members, talking about what went on in that home when he was a child. You've read his notebooks, turned the pages of his diary. And you've seen these photos. You've seen the image of him crying at his wedding. You've seen this image, his mom hugging him, or this one, snuggling with his goofy son, or this one, hanging out with his friends. And you've also, of course, seen the images of his beloved mother with her face swollen beyond recognition after a beating that Nate wasn't able to stop. And there are other images, too, of course, that add up to the picture of who Nate Holden is and the value that his life has. Except they have to exist only in our imaginations, because there's no one with a photo there to take a picture when Nate was standing between his parents, a young boy trying to hold them off each other. When he was huddling with his sister in their bunk bed, while it sounded like their entire world was falling down around them. When he was crying at his high school graduation, when he should have been celebrating his achievement because his mother was living on the streets, addicted to crack. There's also the image of Nate kneeling in the woods, having just done the most terrible thing of his life, praying that the officers would just shoot him. In that moment, Nate saw no value in his life. And now, amazingly, that decision about how to place a value on this man's human life, that's placed in your hands, your 24 hands. This is not a case that calls for the death penalty. Please return a verdict of life. Thank you.